see. Oop. Oh, wait. Hello, my name is Amber Mack. I'm a senior history student, and my research, as presented, is Patriots, Saints, and Red Women. Just a little background and introduction. My research rests on a visual analysis of the weaponization and villainization of women's bodies within American military culture during World War II. The US military shifted the dynamic of culpability surrounding venereal diseases onto women, and to support the shift in dynamic, began depicting women in a way that villainized them within the eyes of GIs. And for information, GIs is just another word for servicemen in World War II. The impact of this attribution of blame can be observed through entertainment and art media. In this case, I will be using posters, propaganda posters, and propaganda comics. Women had occupied a crucial role in maintaining the morale of troops at home and abroad. But in order to preserve both the fighting spirit and physical condition of the men, such that treating VD, venereal disease, took up to 2 years for men during the war years, the US military sought to control the perception of sexually active women and the dangers they supposedly pose, while also maintaining the concept of a girl worth fighting for back home. This need to balance the agendas of morale and health led to the establishment of three distinct tropes that I have laid out: the patriot, the saint, and the red women. As I present in this paper, I will demonstrate how this red color that I have discovered really lays out the foundations of how women have been connected to VD and villainize them in many ways throughout the posters and comics that I will present. So for a little background for those that are unfamiliar, the US entered World War II after the events of Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the issue of morale to keep troops combat ready became a serious issue, as I have hinted before. And this leads down to the issue of how to control sex. But beyond just sex ed and all those related to it, such as venereal disease, it was also important to create a narrative on women's bodies, because there was a continuing development and concern amongst nations of what to do with cross-national relationships and interracial relationships. So there was a need to develop this American woman versus foreign women concept within American propaganda. And on top of that, just for a little background for those that need it, um, previous to World War II, venereal disease was understood as something that women could only spread, and women had to have multiple sexual encounters in order to get venereal disease. So that meant that women were oftentimes not seen as victims of venereal diseases, and only men were. And men were seen to have and believed to have more violent reactions towards the disease compared to women. So women were oftentimes, before World War II, and a little part during the beginnings of World War II, where women were seen as these violent perpetrators and of venereal diseases, and they were the root cause of the spread of venereal diseases on and within around American bases. So for a little historiography and how to ground my research, really I'm looking at three main things: a feminist pedagogy, war history, and medical history. So for feminist pedagogy, I'm really looking at how to look at culture and politics within a feminist scope. And these are the two scholars that I have looked at, which is Cynthia Inlow's Banana Beaches and Bases, and Marilyn Hegarty's Victory Girls, Khaki Wackies, and Patriots. Cynthia Inlow's book is mainly, that I've gotten, is mainly about how to use a feminist lens to study politics and culture, and really how to put women as the center of these topics and how to analyze these topics looking at women. While Hegarty is doing just about the same thing, but more so I get a lot of my information of how to study World War II and culture within World War II through this book, which is where I got my term patriotism. For war history, I look at sex, sexuality, and international politics. I really look at Mary Louise Roberts' What Soldiers Do, which is a more distinct book that looks at American soldiers within France and how these intimate sexual relationships between soldiers and local French women created an intense political climate that caused a lot of pressure on American government and French government. And lastly, I look at medical history, and I look exactly at Alan Brandt's No Magic Bullet and Magnus Hirschfield's The Sexual History of World War II. No Magic Bullet is more about the history of venereal diseases within the US and how this developing study of venereal diseases was created through multiple new studies and new environments that led to these to the development and evolution of venereal diseases. And while Magnus Hirschfield is more known as a clinical sexologist, his book Sexual History of the World War is very distinct in the ways that it really lays out and looks at clinical in a clinical lens on American soldiers during World War I and the foundations of how sex and sexuality is closely tied to war throughout European history and in a sense American history. I'm sorry. And while I am not arguing against any of these authors and the works that they produce, I am adding into the discussion by observing how propaganda directed at GIs also reflects the ways that women and their sexuality were commodities during the war, as well as a representation of an evolving narrative of venereal disease as more studies were done throughout World War II. My research will directly look at and focus on specifically art propaganda of venereal disease meant to hide under the guise of being sex education, but still contains the underlying message of sex shaming focused on the menace disease women that the menace disease women had on war efforts and American might. So to go into this idea of the patriot and the red woman, we have to look at how women were connected to the Axis powers and how women were seen as agents of the Axis powers. What I have noticed within these two posters is that venereal disease began to have a narrative of being closely connected to being some type of agent of the enemy. In the case of the poster on the right, as you can see, the prostitute has red cheeks, red lips, and red fingernails. And and engaging with a prostitute and entertaining a prostitute in many ways, as the poster suggests, is basically giving the victory to the enemy, which is the Axis powers. On the left, as you can see, although the woman is not directly in red, it sort of is hidden in the back as if she is sort of the secret agent that carries the agendas of the enemy forward. And this sort of connects her to venereal diseases in many ways, as I have mentioned before, because venereal disease in this case was oftentimes connected to the enemy. And then this develops into this concept of the red women. All of these three things merges into one and becomes what you see on the left, which is she may be a bag of trouble. This is by far the most popular image of venereal disease during World War II, and this is oftentimes seen as a symbol and the face of venereal disease. In this case, as you can see, there's a lot to go into, but once again, red, a symbol of venereal disease, is once again brought into here, and she is completely coated in red. Her face, her makeup, her clothes, everything is in red. But most importantly, as some of you guys might have picked up, she is a foreign woman, and it's not just it's her beret, it's her hairstyle, everything about her screams a foreign woman. And in doing so, this idea of the foreign woman being the representation of venereal disease and dangers of venereal disease is carried out through other recreations of propaganda on venereal disease, as you can see on the right. This image of the foreign woman being synonymous with the dangers of venereal disease is carried out throughout the war. In contrast to the red woman is the saintly figure of the American sweetheart. Oftentimes, American women are not seen in discussions, a propaganda discussion on venereal diseases, but when they are, they oftentimes use the sexual purity of the American woman as a selling point and the drive to avoid venereal disease. So oftentimes the American woman, as you can see on remember on the poster on the right, is that women are seen as this beacon of purity and hope. They're sexually pure for the American man, and therefore you should remain sexually pure for your American woman as well. And oftentimes these women are tied to the ideas of family, peace, female purity, and lastly, this, like I mentioned, I'm so sorry, I stumbled over my words. Sexual purity once again. To look at this poster more clearly, you can see that red is once again still here since we're talking about venereal disease. But this red color fades away into this cursive gray look as they go into, I'm sorry, this is blocking, as they go into they are waiting. And the center of this poster is really about this American woman, this gray figure, this black and white photo of an American woman waiting for you longingly. And then at the bottom, there's the family. Maybe it's the parents. Who knows? But the main point is that the woman is really there. They're here. The body is there. And they're still selling the woman. But in this case, they're seen as this beacon of hope. But then, as I mentioned before, as the war progressed and these ideas of venereal disease began to develop, there's this continuing concern of the evolution of how venereal disease is spread. As the war progressed and as more venereal disease clinics and studies are conducted within American bases overseas and in the US, um, clinical doctors began to discover that venereal disease was not some hardy disease that only women can spread. In fact, women are victims to venereal disease as well, and men could be spreaders. Now, as the war began to end, there was this continuing disturbance within American bases in the US that venereal disease was really rapidly spreading near and within the bases. And it became a concern for the American government to address this concern. But at the same time, they cannot put these American women under the same scrutiny as their foreign counterparts. So, how would you present this? Well, this is where the patriothood comes into mind. Women are still seen as spreaders in some cases, but they are shown sort of ambiguous in their intent. They are no longer the enemy. Venereal disease are no longer the enemy or the aggressor in this case, but the women are just sort of naive, sort of in some ways stupid in their role in the spreading of venereal disease. And oftentimes in this display of women, American women with venereal diseases, they show mutual flirtation or aggressively, or servicemen aggressively seducing their American women counterparts. I felt like comics were the best representation of this idea because it's extremely intense. So for the first comic that I have shown, it's worth waiting. You can see once again that this naive American woman is displayed. This American country girl is sort of mutually flirting with this sailor, and they eventually she spreads a venereal disease to the sailor. She's dressed in red, which is a symbol that she is carrying venereal disease. But the point is that this sort of alludes to the narratives at the time of who were the ones near American bases that were spreading venereal disease. At the time that the narratives talking about women that have venereal disease near bases were describing these American girls as naive, as sexually blooming. They were stupid, and they were oftentimes country girls, which you can see all of these within these comics. And the ticking time bomb, as you can see in the third panel, it sort of alludes to the sense of the stupidity in some ways of the American girl not knowing their role in venereal diseases in this case. And to really drive into the point of how this concept of the American girl a contrast to their foreign counterpart, you can see in this second comic where it really shows how not only just that American women with venereal diseases and foreign women were sort of still pitted against each other, but this actually counters to the previously discussed pure American sweetheart. So in this case, you can see within the comic the American man turns his back and ignores all the foreign women. Whether they're coated in red or not, he ignores them completely. But when he returns to home, he still has this idea of the pure American sweetheart. So he tries to engage and actively looks to engage in a sexual encounter with an American girl. It didn't turn out well. As you can see, the American girl has a red bow, meaning that she carried venereal disease. But you can see that this American girl, in contrast to the other girls shown above, the foreign women, she has her back turned. She wasn't trying to engage with this sailor until he tried to engage with her. There's a lot of, once again, the idea that the American women with venereal disease are are ambiguous in their intent, and they're not really sexually seeking out American men and to ruin American might at that time.
Okay, thank you, Amber.
Okay.
We are out of time, but thank you for having this slide for the conclusion. I am sure it's a perfect segue for our audience to ask any questions. So let me just prompt the audience that we have 5 minutes for questions. And if I don't, this is really fascinating, and I feel like I learned a lot about like representations of women and during the war. I'm curious what it was about this specific subject that drew you in. Like, how did you develop this idea for this project?
I sort of worked backwards in this case. I originally planned to look at international politics and how sex plays into international politics, which alludes to the development of gay rights and anti-gay movement after and the whole concept of the housewife syndrome after World War II. But due to COVID, I had to restrict my research into something that can be done through the digital space,
Right.
which is then analyzing posters. Yes.
Right, that made sense. It's very visual. We have a question from the audience here. Jacob is asking, I have a question regarding continuity between World War I and World War II when there is time, and whether there is anything you wanted to include but couldn't.
Um,
Yeah, to elaborate a little bit, I was asking, you mentioned Magnus Hirschfeld and how he was looking at the First World War. And I was wondering, did you find continuities between the way they handled this in the First World War and the way they handled this in the Second World War?
in World War II was sort of the prototype on how to handle sexual encounters, and American ran brothels at the time, and they sort of went back and forth on how to treat this issue. What I've noticed was that they discovered in World War II that it was really important to maintain some sexual interaction near or within the U.S. bases to maintain morale, and that carried over during World War II. And anything that I couldn't include, I would say that I recognized that within these posters and within sexual encounters in the military, that I have noticed that there were sort of these anti-homosexual sort of sentiments in these posters, sort of saying that you have to encounter a sex workers overseas or with a woman in general to prove that you're not a homosexual. And that was something I could not dive into at the time. And also these racial tensions and these biases towards people of color and the treatment of people of color with venereal diseases, especially the violence that they perpetrated on Black bodies, on the ways that they treated and handled venereal diseases in clinic and around bases.
Right. Thank you, Amber. And then one final question in the last couple of minutes that we have left. This is a question from Randolph. Is there a connection between the images of women in the VD posters and the way that pinups became a strong visual phenomenon during the war? Did the VD posters play off the pinup discourse? This is something that I was curious about too when I was watching your presentation.
I didn't really dig into this, but it was something in the back of my mind I did sort of noticed this. I think the foreign woman really plays against these pinup girls. Oftentimes, American women or American styles were shown a lot sexually and a lot positively within pinups, but foreign women in this case was shown in such violence and such aggression, and oftentimes they're tied to VD, as I have shown, that it was sort of a way of trying to reject and trying to teach American men to not engage with foreign women, which in many cases did not work, and in many cases did work.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This is a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for it. And you can turn off your recording now. Thank you.